Well, good afternoon. It's great to be with you. It's great to join you at what are extraordinary times. Let me thank Liberty University for hosting this, for the tremendous work you do. I love the good men and women at Liberty, and thank you for having courage each and every day. The topic of this conference is incredibly important. In my judgment, China poses the single greatest geopolitical threat to the United States over the next century. And it's important to understand that China, their objectives are not short-term. They are fighting a 1,000-year war. And their objectives are nothing short of complete global domination. You know, for a long time, there were a lot of people in Washington, D.C. who were apologists for China, Democrats and Republicans, who would say there's nothing wrong with working hand in hand with the Chinese communists. The more business we do with them, the better. And they would diminish any threat. I think the most lasting foreign policy consequence of the coronavirus pandemic is a fundamental reevaluation of the United States' relationship with China and indeed the world's relationship with China. Last fall, in October, I did an Asia tour. I traveled to Pearl Harbor, and then Japan, and then Taiwan, and then India, and then Hong Kong. And it was very much designed to be a friends and allies tour. All nations surrounding China, all dealing directly with Chinese increased military aggression, economic aggression, bullying. And the topic of the entire discussion at every one of those meetings was how to deal with China and the growing threat from China. In Taiwan, the Chinese government refuses to acknowledge that Taiwan even exists, acting instead under the myth, the fiction, that Taiwan is part of China. I was proud to be there on Taiwan's National Day. I joined President Tsai at the parade for Taiwan's National Day, the first U.S. senator in 34 years to be in Taiwan on their National Day. In Hong Kong, I met with leaders, I met with dissidents, I met with protesters. Over 2 million people took to the streets of Hong Kong to speak out against tyranny and oppression. Hong Kong, I believe, is the new Berlin. And indeed, from Hong Kong, I did a Sunday show back in the United States from Hong Kong via satellite link-up, dressed in all black, in solidarity with the protesters. This threat from China is real. It has been significant a long time, and the rest of the world, and indeed much of Washington, is only now beginning to realize the scope and scale of it. This coronavirus pandemic, in a very real sense, the government of China bears direct responsibility for this global disaster. In at least two capacities. Number one, the origin of the virus. We now know that there were not one but two Chinese-controlled labs in Wuhan that were not only studying viruses, they were studying coronaviruses. They were not only studying coronaviruses, they were studying coronaviruses derived from bats. Bats that are found in native population. The closest to Wuhan those bats are found is 900 miles away. We know that those labs were studying the bat coronaviruses right there in Wuhan. One of those two labs is a few hundred yards. You could almost throw a baseball from one of those two labs to the wet market where the first major outbreak occurred in Wuhan. I think the weight of the evidence suggests that the coronavirus that has caused this pandemic was being studied in one or both of the labs, and that it somehow escaped accidentally. Now note, that does not mean, as some have theorized, that the virus was engineered in a lab. That does not mean that the lab deliberately released that. I don't think we have the evidence to back up either of those claims. What we do know is that in past years there were multiple U.S. State Department wires raising concerns about the very shoddy and poor security at those labs and the risk that a virus might accidentally escape and cause a coronavirus world pandemic. That's what the State Department was saying before this happened. That means that we need to have real transparency. We need to have real accountability. We need to go in objectively and find out who knew what and when they knew it. But the weight of the evidence right now suggests that the origin of this virus was escaping accidentally from a Chinese government-controlled lab. But the second part of China's culpability on the coronavirus is even clearer. And indeed, it is indisputable, which is that China actively covered up, hid, lied, did everything they could to suppress information about this virus. When you had Chinese whistleblowers, and you want to talk about heroes, physicians, and journalists who spoke up and said, this is a problem, we've got this outbreak, let's stop it. What did the Chinese government do? It went and arrested them. It put them in jail, it silenced them. It charged them, it said, you may not speak about this. Any responsible government, when those whistleblowers pointed out this new and dangerous respiratory disease, would have gone in with public health officials, would have found the people who were infected, would have quarantined them at the outset. And had China done that, there's a very real possibility that this could have remained a regional outbreak instead of a global pandemic that has cost the lives of over 600,000 people worldwide. The Chinese government's lies, its mendacity, its cover-up played a very direct role in the human suffering and the trillions in economic devastation that has flowed out of this pandemic. And as evidence of what I said a moment ago, that this pandemic is causing a worldwide reassessment of our relationship with China, look no further than the United Kingdom and Huawei. So before coronavirus, the United Kingdom government unfortunately had made the decision to allow Huawei to install and operate a significant part of their civilian telecom infrastructure. I and others in the U.S. government had spoken out loudly against it. The U.K. is part of what's called the Five Eyes intelligence network. Those are our closest allies with whom we share our most sensitive secrets. But yet Huawei is not a telecom company. Huawei is not a private company in any ordinary sense of the word. Huawei is a spy agency. It's a spy agency dressed up as a company that exists to allow and facilitate the Chinese Communist government committing espionage abroad. And the way they try to sucker other countries into it is they sell their equipment at below market rates. That doesn't make any sense until you realize they're not actually trying to make money. This is a military endeavor. This is an espionage endeavor. The time the UK made that decision, I had just recently launched a podcast called Verdict with Ted Cruz. And one of my early guests was Nigel Farage, the British leader who spearheaded Brexit. And Nigel and I spent quite a bit of time talking about Huawei and the decision of the British government to go down that road. And one of the points I made with Nigel on the Verdict podcast is I said, listen, we love the Brits. The UK are dear, dear, close, important allies. But if they're going to have telecom equipment installed by Communist China that could intercept our most sensitive secrets, we're going to have to take steps in response to that. And as I put it then, 4 eyes are better than 6. As much as we love the Brits, if the price of sharing secrets with them is the Chinese get them, we're going to have to change our practices. Well, what happened since then? The coronavirus pandemic, the devastation, and suddenly the British government reassessed whether they thought it was a good idea for the Chinese communists to have the ability to intercept communications within their nation. That is an important positive step. In the last several years, I've introduced roughly a dozen different pieces of legislation focused on how we solve this problem, and how we solve this problem from multiple different angles. So going at the censorship. I've introduced legislation that would sanction Chinese officials who censor health information, like those Chinese officials that censored the information about COVID-19 that cost over 600,000 people's lives, that would impose sanctions on those officials. You know, we used to think of censorship as just a human rights issue. Now we know it's a national security issue and a public health issue. Propaganda. China engages in rampant propaganda. One of the ways they do so at U.S. universities are through what are called Confucius Institutes, institutes that are controlled by the Chinese government that engage in propaganda in American universities and engage in espionage in American universities. On the Senate Armed Services Committee, I introduced legislation to prohibit Department of Defense funding from going to universities if they have a Confucius Institute. That legislation got bipartisan support. It got the support of Republicans and Democrats. It was passed into law. It was signed into law. And that legislation has directly resulted in 17 Confucius Institutes at universities across the country being shut down. But propaganda doesn't just occur in our universities. It also occurs in Hollywood. You know, Hollywood likes to position themselves as woke champions of free speech. And yet those same Hollywood producers are more than happy to have the Communist Party of China edit American movies. So, for example, Top Gun, one of the perhaps the greatest Navy recruiting film in history. The sequel is scheduled to come out later this year. In the sequel, in the original Top Gun, on the back of the bomber jacket, Maverick, there's a flag of Taiwan and a flag of Japan. But the communist overlords decided acknowledging that either Taiwan or Japan exists was unacceptable, so what did Hollywood say? They meekly said, fine, we'll edit it out. I want you to ask for a second, what does it say to the world that Maverick is afraid of the damn Chinese communists? What does it say that Hollywood is? And by the way, it's not just on issues that are directly relevant to China and foreign policy. I'll give you another example. Bohemian Rhapsody. Fabulous movie, biopic on Freddie Mercury, the lead singer of Queen. The Chinese communist censors decided they didn't like the fact that parts of the movie show that Freddie Mercury was gay. So they said, can you please edit out of the film that he's gay? Just take those scenes out so we don't have to see that. And Hollywood, those social justice warriors that they are, said, sure, no problem, we'll take it out. Let me ask you something. How the hell do you tell Freddie Mercury's story without acknowledging he was gay? It was a pretty big part of Freddie Mercury's life. So I've introduced legislation called the Script Act, which simply says there are enormous U.S. assets that the federal government makes available to American filmmakers. Things like the DOD allowing them to use ships and planes and tanks, or DHS allowing them to use Border Patrol equipment to film. The big element of a lot of movies. The Script Act says very simply that the federal government is not going to allow you to use federal government assets if you are going to allow Communist China to edit your films. If you want access to government assets, don't give a hostile foreign power the ability to edit the films. Combating propaganda is important. Let me focus on one final area, which is the supply chain. China has systematically targeted the U.S. supply chain. It has gone after critical infrastructure. We look at, in the midst of this pandemic, PPE, masks and gloves and gowns. Huge percentage of it worldwide is manufactured in China. You look at pharmaceuticals, the degree to which the American people are right now dependent on Chinese pharmaceuticals because the government created cartels to systematically target American production of pharmaceuticals, whether antibiotics or cancer drugs or Alzheimer's drugs or antidepressants, and to drive out of business American production of those drugs. And so right now, an enormous percentage of the medicines we rely on are manufactured in China. And just if you think, well, gosh, what's the big deal with that? Just a few months ago, one of the state-controlled newspapers in China explicitly threatened during this pandemic to cut off pharmaceuticals to the American market as a tool of economic warfare. Let me say right now, if they do that, that's not economic warfare merely. That is actual warfare. That is literally threatening the lives and safety of millions of Americans who rely upon medications to stay alive and healthy. And so I've been leading the fight to bring critical infrastructure, to bring the supply chain back to the United States, to create tax incentives to bring them back, whether it is infrastructure like PPE and pharmaceuticals, or whether it is rare earth minerals that are integral to defense components and technology, which likewise China systematically went after and acquired dominant positions. China's fighting a 1,000-year war. We need to recognize the threat that they pose, and we need strong leadership in Washington to take them on. This is a fight I've been leading for the 8 years I've been in the Senate. It's a fight I intend to keep leading for many years to come. Thank you.
Well done, Senator. Senator, thank you. Thank you for those words. I know I don't have a lot of time with you, so I want to focus in on, and I think you hit on the most important points that every American right now, when we hear what China has done, when we hear that we have to turn to China for PPE after this virus that was clearly leaked, I won't say created, but leaked from the Wuhan labs. We're at their mercy. They've they've instilled in us a need of what they have. What do we do about it, sir? I know you're introducing legislation, but does it go beyond that? You call it a 1,000-year war, and we've talked a lot of war. Does it ever get to actual war with China?
Look, I hope not, but it might. I think there's a strong analogy to the Cold War and to the United States and the Soviet Union. And I would say the period we have been in for the last 20 years is analogous to the period we were in the Cold War in the 1970s, where you had a lot of people denying it was going on. You had a lot of politicians, Democratic politicians, a lot of people in the media who said, oh, the Soviet Union is unstoppable, we can't keep up. And if you remember when Reagan came in, and they asked him, they said, what's your objective in the Cold War? He said, very simple, we win, they lose. He described the Soviet Union as an evil empire. He said Marxism, Leninism will end up on the ash heap of history. That clarity was profoundly important. Now, to be clear, Reagan didn't want a shooting war with the Soviet Union. No one wants to see two massive militaries firing missiles and killing millions. That is a very bad outcome. But we won the Cold War through a military buildup that they couldn't keep up with, through an economic boom that they couldn't keep up with, through investments in technology, things like the Strategic Defense Initiative and missile defense, which is an area we need to keep investing in vis-a-vis China. And we won the Cold War through the clarity of understanding who they are. If you come to my Senate office, you've been to my Senate office. Mm-hmm. The dominant feature there is a gigantic painting. It's about the size of this backdrop behind us. And it is a painting of Ronald Reagan standing before the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin saying, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. The most important words in modern times. That kind of clear leadership is needed with respect to China, and that clarity, we can see the effects of it right now with the UK pulling out of Huawei. That's the virtue of clarity, and clarity and sunshine is powerful.
What is the metaphoric Chinese wall? I'm not talking about the wall. I'm talking about the wall between East and West Berlin. What is the equivalent in China?
Well, listen, I think focusing on Hong Kong and Taiwan, there's a reason I focus on Hong Kong and Taiwan so much, because both are fundamental threats to Chinese legitimacy. Look, the Chinese, the number one people the Chinese government is repressing are the Chinese. There are 1.3 billion people in China who are under brutal dictatorial control. And the reason they're so scared of Taiwan and Hong Kong is they show that people who are Chinese ethnically and in every respect can live much better lives just through freedom. They are illustrations that free enterprise works 1,000 times better than communism does, and it produces better quality of life. It's why China is so afraid of them. And let me give you an example, and we'll use the Cold War analogy. So several years ago in the Senate, I introduced legislation to rename the street in front of the Chinese embassy Liu Xiaobo Plaza. Liu Xiaobo, famed Nobel Peace Laureate who stood up for democracy in China, was wrongfully imprisoned in China. And the strategy of renaming the street, I actually borrowed from Reagan. So Reagan, during the Cold War, renamed the street in front of the Soviet embassy Sakharov Plaza after the Soviet dissident. And you want to talk about being powerful. Anytime someone wanted to write a letter to the embassy, you had to write the name of the dissident. You had to acknowledge that they exist. So that legislation I introduced, I went to the Senate floor to pass it, and multiple times, Senator Dianne Feinstein, Democrat from California, came up and objected, and we debated on the Senate floor. And Senator Feinstein said, but if we pass this, it will irritate the Chinese government. To which my response is, look, that's not a bug, that's a feature.
That's the point.
That is exactly the point. So right. She objected multiple times. This is during the Obama administration. So what I did, I put a hold on every State Department nominee that the Obama administration put forward. Now, that drove them nuts. And so they came to me and said, all right, how do we get you to lift this hold? I said, very simple, pass my legislation. You pass my legislation, I'll lift the hold. They ended up agreeing. Legislation passed the Senate 100-0. So Senator Feinstein withdrew her objection. It passed 100-0, and I lifted the hold. Unfortunately, it then went to the Republican House of Representatives, where it died in the Republican House. That was unfortunate. But let me give the epilogue because it's encouraging. Fast forward to the beginning of the Trump administration. Liu Xiaobo had passed away, but his widow, Liu Xia, was still in China and was being held against her wishes. I had breakfast with Rex Tillerson, who was then the Secretary of State. And Rex was telling me that in his negotiations with the Chinese, when they were listing their top foreign policy objectives, one of the top 3 objectives that the Chinese laid out they had was stop Cruz's legislation on Liu Xiaobo Plaza from passing, because it terrified them to acknowledge that was happening. And I'll tell you what I told Rex. I said, all right, if you want Rex, use me as the bad guy. You can tell them I'm going to pass it. And you know it's not a bluff because I've already passed it unanimously through the Senate once, so they know I can do it. Tell them I'm going to pass it, but if they release Liu Xia, if they let her go, I'll step back and stop pushing it. Well, just a few weeks later, you know what they did? They released Liu Xia and let her go. That's how terrified they are of truth and clarity and sunlight. And this conference is playing a big part in providing that truth. Very good. I know, Senator, you're they're Yankee. You got somewhere to go. Very quickly, the NBA obviously has to play ball with China, and they want to play ball with China.
Yes. The senator has to go vote in 5 minutes.
Oh, you have a 5-minute. Yeah. Quick thought to Cuban NBA. Oh, look, the NBA is kissing up to China because they want to make money, and it is sad. When the general manager of the Houston Rockets, my home team, when he sent out an innocuous tweet that said, free Hong Kong, China went nuts. It shows you just how scared they are of just a little bit of attention. And the NBA, sadly, and this is a pattern throughout corporate America, groveled and obsequiously apologized. You had people like LeBron James defending the Chinese. Never mattered that they're murderers, that they're torturers, that 1 million Uyghurs are in concentration camps right now. It's all about the bucks of access to Chinese market. And part of addressing them that I spend a lot of time is trying to help sports leagues, trying to help big Fortune 500 companies, and trying to help the media. An awful lot of the media reporters are terrified to say anything bad about China because they want access to that Chinese market. And that corruption is really deep and really profound. And by the way, quite a few think tanks in Washington are also suckling on the Chinese dollars. And all of that we've got to address in a comprehensive way. Senator Ted Cruz, everybody. Thank you, sir. All right. Thank you.